Secular cycles. Secular cycles. This page intentionally left blank. Secular cycles. Peter Turchin and Sergey A Nefedov. Copyright 2009 by Princeton University Press. Published by Princeton University Press, 41 William Street, Princeton, New Jersey, 08540 in the United Kingdom. Princeton University Press, 6 Oxford Street, Woodstock, Oxfordshire, OX201TW. All rights reserved. Library of Congress, Cataloguing and Publication Data. Turchin, Peter, 1957. Secular Cycles, Peter Turchin and Sergey A Nefedov. P. Mails includes bibliographical references and index. ISBN 978-0691-13, 696-7, hardcover, Alcan paper. 1. Population, mathematical models. 2. Demography, mathematical models. 3. Business cycles, mathematical models. 4. Economic development, mathematical models. I. Nefedov, S.A., Sergey Alexandrovich, 2nd. Title: H.B. 849.5 1T87 2009 304.6-DC 2008050576. British Library Cataloguing in Publication Data is available. This book has been composed in Jansen, printed on acid-free paper. Infinity Press.Princeton.edu, printed in the United States of America. 10987654321. Contents. Table of Units and Currencies 9. Chapter 1. Introduction. The theoretical background. 1. 1.1. Development of ideas about demographic cycles. 1.2. A synthetic theory of secular cycles. 6. 1.3. Variations and extensions. 21. 1.4. Empirical approaches. 29வது. Chapter 2. Medieval England. The Plantagenet cycle, 1150 to 1485. 35. 2.1. Overview of the cycle, 35. 2.2. The expansion phase, 1150 to 1260. 47. 2.3 stagflation, 1260 to 1315. 49. 2.4 crisis, 1315 to 1400. 58. 2.5 depression, 1400 to 1485. 69.26. Conclusion 77. Chapter 3. Early Modern England, the Tudor-Stuart cycle, 1485 to 1730, 81 3.1. Overview of the cycle, 81 3.2. Expansion, 1485 to 1580, 87.33 stagflation, 1580 to 1640, 91.34 crisis, 1640 to 60, 97.35 depression, 1660 to 1730, 101 3.6. Conclusion 107 Appendix to Chapter 3, 108. Chapter 4. Medieval France, the Capetian cycle, 1150 to 1450, 111 4.1. Overview of the cycle, 111 4.2. Expansion, 1150 to 1250, 115, 4.3 stagflation, 1250 to 1315, 117, 4.4 crisis, 1315 to 665, 121, 4.5 depression, 1365 to 1450, 129 4.6. Conclusion, a near-perfect multi-secular cycle, 141C on TNTS 6. Chapter 5. Early Modern France, the Valois cycle, 1450 to 1660. 143 5.1. Overview, 143 5.2. Expansion, 1450 to 1520. 147.53. Stagflation, 1520 to 70. 149.54. Crisis, 1570 to 1600. 153.55. A case study. The Norman nobility, 156.56 depression, 1600 to 1660, 169.57. Conclusion 174. Chapter 6. Rome, the Republican cycle, 350 to 30 BCE, 176, 6.1. Overview of the cycle, 176, 6.2. An unusually long expansion, 350 to 180 BCE, 185. 6.3 stagflation, 180 to 130 BCE, 189. 6.4. The late Republican crisis, 130 to 30 BCE, 201. 6.5. The end of the disintegrative trend, 205. 6.6. Conclusion, 208. Chapter 7. Rome. The Principate cycle, 30 BCE, 285 CE, 211 7.1. Overview of the cycle, 211 7.2. Expansion, 27 BCE, 96 CE. 224 7.3 stagflation, 96 165 CE, 229 7.4 crisis, 165 to 97 CE, 233.75 depression, 197 to 285 CE, 236.76. Conclusion 238. Chapter 8. Russia, the Muscovy cycle, 1460 to 1620, 248.1, the 15th century crisis, 248.2, expansion, 1460 to 1530, 241. 8.3 stagflation, 1530 to 65, 244. 8.4. Crisis, 1565 to 1615, 252. 8.5. Conclusion, 258. Chapter 9. Russia, the Romanov cycle, 1620 to 1922, 261 9.1, expansion, 1620 to 1800, 261 9.2, stagflation, 1800 to 1905, 274.93, crisis, 1905 to 22, 287.94, conclusion 299, C on T, NTS 1. Chapter 10. General conclusions, 303, 10.1, population numbers 303, 10.2, elite dynamics 304, 10.3, the state 306, 10.4, sociopolitical instability 307, 10.5, are there general laws of historical dynamics 311, acknowledgements 315, references cited 317, index 341. This page intentionally left blank. Units and currencies. Unit ABR explanation. Metric 1, hectare, hay 10,000 square meters, equals 0.01 square kilometers, 1 quintal 100 kilograms, 1 hectoliter equals 100 liters, equals 0.75 quintals of grain, A. England, 1 acre is here as 0.4 hectares, 1 virgate, 1 yard land, 30 acres equals 12 hectares, 1 quarter. Q 8 bushels equals 2.9 hectoliters equals 2.18 quintals of grain, a 1 bushel bus, 0.352 hectoliters, 1 pound 20 shillings 1 shilling, S, 12 pence, D, 1 penny, D, 1.33 grams silver in 1300, 0.72 grams in 1500, 0.46 grams in 700 ayrıtı Nuravde. France, 1 sautier, 1.5, 6 hectoliters, 1 livre tournoi LT, 67 grammes, silver in 1300, 21,7 grammes dans 1500, 7,65 grammes dans 1700, 1 livre 20 sous 1 sou, sol, S, 12 deniers, D, 1 denier, D. Rome and Egypt, 1 modius 8.62 litres, 1 eugerum 0.25 hectares 1 pound, Roman. 327.45 grams, 1 as liberal 1 Roman pound of bronze before 220 BC, E1 as sextantal 2 ounces, or 1/6 pound of bronze, Cycles 200 BCE, 1 denarius 3.9 grams of silver, 2nd century BCE, 1 sestertius HS 0.25 ديناري واحد موديمنوس 52 لترا وواحد أربطة 4.5 مودي. Russia 1 Deshyatin 1.09 hectares, 1 vite 15 Deshyatins, 1 pud, 16.4 kilograms 1 quarter, Chedvert, 4 puds in the 16th century, 6 puds in the 17th century, 8 puds from end of 17th century 1, yuft 1 quarter of rye plus 1 quarter of oats, 1 ruble, 67.5 grams silver in 1535, 24.7 grams in 1700, 18 grams in 1901, Denga 1/200th of a ruble. Throughout the book, we use the conversion factor of 0.75 between the volume and weight of wheat. That is, 1 hectoliter equals 0.75 quintals. This is a very rough approximation. because the conversion factor varies with the grain variety and thus between historical regions and periods. This page intentionally left blank. Chapter 1. Introduction, the theoretical background. 1.1 Development of ideas about demographic cycles. The modern science of population dynamics begins with the publication in 1798 of an essay on the principle of population by Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus pointed out that when population increases beyond the means of subsistence, food prices increase, real wages decline, and per capita consumption, especially among the poorer strata, drops. Economic distress, often accompanied by famine, plague, and war, leads to lower reproduction and higher mortality rates, resulting in a slower population growth, or even decline, that, in turn, allows the subsistence means to catch up. The restraints on reproduction are loosened, and population growth resumes, leading eventually to another subsistence crisis. Thus, the conflict between the population's natural tendency to increase and the limitations imposed by the availability of food results in the tendency of population numbers to oscillate. Malthus's theory was extended and further developed by David Ricardo in his theories of diminishing returns and rent, Ricardo 1817. According to the Malthusian argument, the oscillation in population numbers should be accompanied by systematic changes in certain economic variables, most notably food prices. Fortunately, data on prices are reasonably abundant in historical sources, and it is possible to construct time series documenting price fluctuations over very long periods of time. Compilations of price trends appeared as early as the 16th century. For example, Ruggiero Romano, 1967, reports that a time series of grain prices between 1500 and 1593 appeared in an appendix of La Patria del Friuli Restaurata by Jacopo Steinero, published in 1595 in Venice. The data on prices in medieval and early modern England were made available to historians by Thorold Rogers, 1862. By the 1930s, the empirical material had accumulated to the point where it became very clear that European prices had gone through a number of very slow swings between 1200 and 1900. Simiond, 1932, Griziotti-Kretschmann, 1935, Abel, 1980. A most important and lasting contribution was Wilhelm Abel's Agrarkrisen und Agrarkonjunktur, the first German edition of which was published in 1935. Abel compiled a rich dataset containing time series information about prices, wages, rents, and population movements in Western and Central Europe from the 13th to the 20th centuries, ensuring Chapter 12. That the empirical importance of his work would remain high to this day. The most striking pattern to emerge was the wave-like movement of grain prices, expressed in terms of grams of silver. There were three waves or secular trends. Abel, 1981. 1 point an upward movement during the 13th century and early 14th century, followed by a decline in the late Middle Ages 2. Another upsurge in the 16th century, followed by a decline or apparent equilibrium, depending on the country, during the 17th century 3. A third increase during the 18th century, followed by irregular fluctuations during the 19th century, eventually converging to an early 20th century minimum. The 20th century saw another, fourth, during the last millennium period of price inflation, Fisher 1996. On the basis of the observed patterns, Abel argued that the fluctuations in the circulation of money could not adequately explain the long-term trends in the price of grain. By contrast, population moved more or less in the same direction as the food prices and in an inverse ratio to wages, Abel 1980, 292 to 93. Abel concluded that the Malthusian-Ricardian theory provided a better explanation of the data than the monetarist theory. Furthermore, the Malthusian-Ricardian theory predicted that an increasing population would result in a specific progression of effects. Rents would rise first, with grain prices lagging behind rents, the price of industrial goods lagging behind grain prices, and workers' wages bringing up the rear. The evidence showed that this was precisely what happened, until the whole system was dramatically changed in the 19th century. Abel's conclusions were soon supported and extended by other history, ends with the most influential contributions made by Michael Poston, working in England, and Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie in France. In a talk given in 1950, Poston rejected a monetarist explanation of long-term price movements during the Middle Ages and firmly asserted the primacy of the demographic factor. Hilton, 1985. Leroy-Ladurie was an even more consistent follower of Malthus. In The Peasants of Languedoc, first published in French in 1966, he argued that southern France went through a great agrarian cycle lasting from the end of the 15th century to the beginning of the 18th. Leroy-Ladurie, 1974, 289. Although Leroy-Ladurie did not completely ignore the social and political aspects of the cycle, his explanation of the causes underlying the cycle was firmly Malthusian. Speaking in 1973, he said, "It is in the economy, in social relations, and even more fundamentally in biological facts, rather than in the class struggle, that we must seek the motive force of history," quoted in Hilton, 1985:4, INT rho du CTION, THEO retai CA LBAC KG rho UND3. Such a radical Malthusian position could not but provoke a reaction from scholars working within the Marxist tradition. Although some Marxist historians doubted the very fact of a drastic and prolonged population decline from 1350 to 1450, Kosminski, 1956, others accepted it but preferred to explain it as the crisis of feudalism. In an influential book first published in 1946, Maurice Dobb argued that the cause of the crisis was the inefficiency of feudalism as a system of production, coupled with the growing needs of the ruling class for revenue. Dobb, 1963, 42-47. The feudal lust for expanded revenue was a result of two processes: growth in the size of the parasitic class and the increasing extravagance of noble consumption. These two tendencies, working synergistically, resulted in an intensificate tie-in of feudal pressure on the peasantry to the point where it destroyed the goose that laid the golden eggs. Dobb's theory occasioned an extensive discussion. One interesting contribution to the theory was Paul Sweezy's proposition that the growing extravagance of the feudal ruling class was a result of the rapid expansion of trade from the 11th century onward, which brought an ever-increasing variety of goods within its reach. Sweezy et al. 1976, 38 முதல் 39. Thus, Sweezy sees the root cause of the 14th century crisis in the impact of this exogenous force on the structure of feudalism. Sweezy et al. 1976, 106. Robert Brenner's 1974 critique of Poston's and Leroy-Ladurie's theories might be regarded as a continuation of the Dobb-Sweezy debate of the 1950s. The Brenner debate papers are collected in Aston and Philpin, 1985, Hilton, 1985. Brenner did not deny that the Malthusian model had a certain compelling logic. Brenner, 1985:14. However, its attempt to explain long-term trends in economic growth and income distribution was doomed from the start because it ignored, abstracted away, the social structure, the most important part of which was the surplus extraction rela, tie-in-ship between the direct producers and the ruling class. Brenner, 1985:10-11. One deficiency of the Malthusian theory, according to Brenner, was the empirical observation that different societies within Europe, starting from similar demographic and economic conditions obtaining after the Black Death, subsequently followed divergent trajectories. For example, serfdom completely disappeared from certain Western European countries, England, France, while making a strong comeback in Central Europe, Poland, Prussia. Thus, different property structures, the landholding system, and different balances of power, the cohesiveness and organization of the ruling class, could result in different paths followed by societies after the demographic catastrophe. The second and even more damaging argument against the Malthusian model is the observation of continuous stagnation of most of the traditional European economies in the late medieval period. Brenner, 1985:18. For CHAPTER 14. Example: the Black Death removed about 1/3 of the English population in the mid-14th century, and by the end of the century the population had been further reduced to 1/2 of its 1300 peak. According to Malthusian logic, such a drastic population decrease should have led to higher agrarian productivity, low food prices and high real wages, and the resumption of vigorous population growth. Indeed, the dynamics of prices and wages were largely in line with the Malthusian predictions. Yet population stagnated for more than a century, with growth resuming only in the late 15th century. Brenner argued that such episodes of long-term stagnation could only be understood as the product of established structures of class relations. Brenner, 1985:18. A decline in the number of direct producers reduced the income of the lords. To maintain their income, the lords attempted to extract a greater amount from each peasant, as well as trying to dispossess one another via brigandage and internal warfare. The result was the disruption of production, leading to a further demographic decline rather than a return to equilibrium as the Malthusian model would predict. Brenner, 1985b, 224. In their responses to Brenner's critique, Poston and Leroy-Ladurie were unable to effectively account for the prolonged post-Black Death depression phase within the Malthusian theory. Poston and Hatcher acknowledged the problem. Indeed, the reason why the recovery was so belated and so sluggish is still one of the incompletely resolved difficulties inherent in the medieval hypotheses Brenner disagrees with. 1985-69. On the other hand, the extreme version of the Marxist thesis, perhaps found in the purest form in Sweezy, which assigns class relations the all-determining role in the economic development of medieval and early modern Europe, would also fail to account for empirical facts. For example, such a purely class struggle-based theory is unable to explain the secular cycles in population, prices, and wages, as well as why exploitation of peasants also fluctuated cyclically. In the end, the critique of Brenner and certain others, most notably Guy Bois, 1984, played a constructive role by pointing out that the Malthusian model neglects an important explanatory variable. What we need is a synthetic theory that encompasses both demographic mechanisms, with the associated economic consequences, and power relations, surplus extraction mechanisms. In the dynamical systems framework, it does not make sense to speak of one or the other as the primary factor. The two factors interact dynamically, each affecting and being affected by the other. We pursue this idea in the next section. It is curious that both sides in the Brenner debate almost entirely ignored the role of the state. This omission is understandable. The Marxists tend to treat the state as merely a vehicle for conveying interests of the ruling class, while the Malthusians' focus has been on the economic variables. INT, RO, DU, CT, ION, TH, EO, RE, TI, CALB, AC, KG, RO, UND 5. There is, however, a significant movement among historical sociologists to bring the state back in. Skocpol, 1979. States are not simply created and manipulated by dominant classes. They are agents in their own right, and they compete with the elites in appropriating resources from the economy. Historians have long recognized that there were recurrent waves of state breakdown and political crises in European history. The calamitous 14th century, Tuchman 1978, the Iron Century of 1550 to 1660, Carmen 1971, and the Age of Revolutions of 1789 to 1849, Hobsbawm 1962. Each of these periods was preceded by a period of sustained and substantial population growth. In a path-breaking book, Jack Goldstone, 1991, argued that there is a causal connection between population growth and state breakdown. The seeds of this theory were already contained in the work of Malthus. Goldstone, however, does not argue that population growth is a direct cause of state collapse. In fact, he carefully distances himself from the strict Malthusian doctrine. Instead, population growth causes social crisis indirectly by affecting social institutions, which in turn affect socio-political stability. For this reason, Goldstone refers to his theory as demographic structural. Demographic because the underlying driving force is population growth. Structural because it is not the demographic trend itself that directly causes the state crisis, but its impact on economic, polity, Cal, and social structures. Goldstone, 1991, XX. We discuss this theory in more detail in the next section, but here we should mention that the verdict on Goldstone's work among historical sociologists has been highly positive. See e.g. Collins 1993, Wickham Crowley 1997, Lee 2002. To summarize, it is becoming increasingly clear to specialists from very diverse fields, demographers and historical economists, social historians, and political scientists, that European societies were subjected to recur-rent long-term oscillations during the second millennium CE, Brodel 1988, Cameron 1989, Fisher 1996. Furthermore, the concept of oscillations in economic, social, and political dynamics was not discovered by the Europeans. Plato, Aristotle, and Han Fei Tzu connected overpopulation to land scarcity, insufficient food supply, poverty, starvation, and peasant rebellions. Parsons, 2005. The Chinese, for example, have traditionally interpreted their history as a series of dynastic cycles. Reischauer, 1960, Meskel, 1965, Usher, 1989, Chu and Li, 1994. The 14th century Arab sociologist Ibn Khaldun developed an original theory of political classes, explaining the history of the Maghreb, Inayatullah, 1997. Are these phenomena, which at first glance seem very diverse, actually related? In this book, we examine the hypothesis that secular cycles, demographic social political oscillations of very long period, centuries long, are the rule rather than the exception in large agrarian states and empires. CHAPTER 16. 1.2 A synthetic theory of secular cycles. The brief review in the previous section focused mainly on the controversies between advocates of various processes as dominant influences. In the heat of the debate, however, the opposing sides tend to simplify and caricature the views of each other. For example, it is clear that neither purely demographic nor purely class conflict explanations of secular cycles work very well when confronted with data. On the other hand, a synthetic theory that incorporates both of these and some other processes may provide us with a viable hypothesis that can be tested with data. The idea is that secular cycles can only be understood as a result of the interaction between several interlinked variables: economic, including demography, social structure, particularly how the elites interact with the producing population and the state, and political, state stability or collapse. In the following paragraphs, we sketch the outlines of such a synthetic explanation. Our explicit focus is on agrarian societies, that is, those in which more than 50% of the population, and typically above 80 to 90%, is involved in agriculture. The demographic component. The demographic component of the theory is based very much on the original insights of Malthus and Ricardo, further developed by neo-Malthusians such as Leroy Ladurie and Postan. The key variable is the population density in relation to the carrying capacity of the local region. The concept of carrying capacity was developed by ecologists in the context of the logistic model, invented by Paul Verhulst and popularized by Raymond Pearl and Reed, 1920. Carrying capacity is defined as the population density that the resources of the habitat can support in the long term. For an excellent discussion of human carrying capacity from an ecologist's point of view, see Cohen, 1995. Resources usually refer to food, though in some environments the limiting resource may be the availability of water or fuel. Carrying capacity, thus, is an upper ceiling on population growth. From the point of view of economics, this limit arises because labor inputs into production suffer from diminishing marginal returns. It is clear that the carrying capacity of a specific region is strongly affected by its physiographic features, the availability of land suitable for agriculture, water supply, soil characteristics, length of the growing season, and so on. It is also affected by year-to-year fluctuations in the temperature and the amount of rainfall, as well as by gradual changes in the climate. In other words, carrying capacity is a variable that changes in both space and time. Finally, and most important, carrying capacity is affected both by the existing level of agricultural technology and by how this technology INT-RODU, CTION, THEO RE, TCALB, ACKG RO, UND7 is employed. As Esther Boserup, 1966-1981, famously argued, population growth can have a positive effect on economic innovation. Although Boserup is widely regarded as being anti-Malthusian, both her insights and those of Malthus can be comfortably combined within the same general theoretical framework. Lee, 1986, Wood, 1998. Thus, adverse effects of population growth on the standard of living can provide strong inducements for the adoption of new means of production. However, in agrarian societies, economic change can win only a temporary respite from marginal immiseration. Wood, 1998, Clark, 2007a. For example, a society that approaches the current limits of population growth can invest in clearing forests, draining swamps, irrigation, and flood control. All these measures will result in an increase in the carrying capacity. However, At some point, there are no more forests to cut or swamps to drain, and if the popular Tian continues to grow, eventually it will again begin pressing against the Malthusian limits. As population density approaches the carrying capacity, a number of related changes affect the society. There are shortages of land and food, and an oversupply of labor. As a result, food prices increase, real wages decline, and per capita consumption, especially among the poorer strata, drops. Economic distress leads to lower reproduction and higher mortality rates, resulting in a slower population growth. Should population density reach the carrying capacity, there would be just enough food to sustain and replace one individual. Birth and death rates would equalize, and population density would be at an equilibrium. At least this is what simple models such as the logistic predict. In actuality, other factors not taken into account by a purely demographic model would preclude the emergence of a stable equilibrium. Population growth in excess of the productivity gains of the land has a fundamental effect on society's structures. The typical changes accompanying population growth are high rents and land prices, increasing fragmentation of peasant holdings or high numbers of landless peasants, and increased migration of landless peasants to cities. Urbanization, measured by the proportion of population inhabiting towns and cities, increases. Cheap labor results in a flowering of trades and crafts. The demand for manufactures increases because the elites profit from high rents on land and lower labor costs. Increased urbanization and conspicuous consumption by the elites promote regional and international trade. The gap between the well-to-do and the poor grows. In rural areas, overpopulation means that no food reserves are available in case of crop failure. Accordingly, years of poor harvest that would hardly be noticed in better times now result in significant mortality and, at worst, in catastrophic famines. Chronic undernourishment creates conditions conducive to the spread of epidemics. CHAPTER18. The cities accumulate landless peasants and jobless artisans, who join the growing ranks of paupers and vagrants. Food riots and wage protests become frequent. Eventually, deepening economic misery leads to peasant and urban uprisings. However, as long as the elites are united and the state maintains control of the military, such popular uprisings have small chance of success. This fundamental point was recently reiterated by Jack Goldstone. It is a profound and repeated finding that the mere facts of poverty and inequality, or even increases in these conditions, do not lead to political or ethnic violence. Gurr 1980, Goldstone 1998, 2002b. In order for popular discontent or distress to create large-scale conflicts, there must be some elite leadership to mobilize popular groups and to create linkages between them. There must also be some vulnerability of the state in the form of internal divisions and economic or political reverses. Otherwise, popular discontent is unvoiced and popular opposition is simply suppressed. Goldstone, 2002a. Social structure, commoners, elites, and social mobility. One important consequence of the law of diminishing returns is that the amount of surplus produced by cultivators is non-linearly related to their numbers. Surplus is the difference between the total production and what is needed for subsistence, that is, the minimum amount of resources needed to support and reproduce each peasant household multiplied by the number of households. The amount of resources needed for subsistence increases linearly with population, while the total product grows slower than linearly as a result of the law of diminishing returns, figure 1.1a. As a result, at a certain critical population density, which we have defined as the carrying capacity, the two curves intersect. This is the point where the surplus becomes zero, and should population increase beyond the carrying capacity, the surplus becomes negative, with the consequence that peasant households do not get enough resources to reproduce themselves and population density must decline. The curve relating the amount of surplus produced to population density crosses zero, both where population density equals zero and where it equals carrying capacity, and there is a hump somewhere between these two critical points, figure 1.1b. Thus, when population increases from a low level, initially the amount of surplus increases, more peasants means more surplus. At some intermediate density, however, the surplus reaches a maximum. This is where the effects of diminishing returns on labor inputs into agriculture begin to be felt. After that point, the surplus begins to decline. The surplus produced by peasants is not made available to the elites and the state automatically. Left alone, peasants would happily consume INTRO due CTION, THEO re TICAL BACKGRO D9. Figure 1.1 effect of population growth on A. Total production, subsistence needs, and B. The production of the surplus. K is the carrying capacity. It themselves, or simply work less, consuming it as extra leisure time. How much of the production ends up in the hands of the elites depends on many economic and political factors. One important dynamic is that the elites are usually able to extract a larger amount of surplus during the late stages of population growth. Specific mechanisms depend on the landholding system. For example, an oversupply of rural labor elevates rents and therefore increases a landowner's profits. In a serfdom-based system, lords can set the level of extraction almost arbitrarily high because oppressed serfs have nowhere to flee. The whole surrounding landscape is at the saturation level, and the only alternative is the life of a vagabond or a bandit, which has always been brutish and short. Thus, most serfs have no realistic alternative to submission. CHAPTER 110. Prospects are equally bleak for free but landless labourers who must secure employment to support themselves and their families. Oversupply of labour leads to depressed wages and chronic unemployment, or underemployment for a substantial part of population. On the other hand, employers, both rural and urban, profit greatly from this economic situation. These considerations suggest that during the late stages of population growth, when commoners are already suffering from economic difficulties, the elites are enjoying a golden age. Both the reproduction of the existing elites and the recruitment of new elites from commoners will be fastest when the amount of extractable surplus is greatest. The expansion of elite numbers should take place during the stagflation phase. See below for the definitions of the phases of a secular cycle, when fast-rising prices and land rents offer the greatest opportunities for rapid accumulation of wealth by current and aspiring elites, and when state fiscal problems lead rulers to increase the sale of privilege and rank. Both factors tend to accelerate social mobility into the elite ranks. As a result, the peak of elite numbers often lags behind that of the general population. The important exception of societies with widespread polygyny is discussed in section 1.3. Such a happy state of events, for the elites, cannot continue for long. First, expansion of elite numbers means that the amount of resources per elite capita begins to decline. This process would occur even if the total amount of surplus stayed constant. But, second, as general population grows closer to the carrying capacity, surplus production gradually declines. The combination of these two trends results in an accelerating fall of average elite incomes. The dynamic processes described above also have a socio-psychological aspect. During the good times, the elites become accustomed to and learn to expect a high level of consumption. This is the growing extravagance of noble households of Dobb and Sweezy. An additional element, as pointed out by Sweezy, is the ever-increasing quantity and variety of goods available to the elites as a result of urbanization, the growth of crafts, and the expansion of trade, factors that are themselves a consequence of population growth. Modern studies of consumption level expectations suggest that people generally aim at matching, and if possible exceeding, the consumption levels of their parents, Eastlin 1980-1996. Thus, what is important is not the absolute level of consumption, but the level in relation to the previous generation. In other words, expected living standard is a culturally determined inertial variable. Inertial because it changes slowly on a generational timescale. If we can extrapolate results obtained by studying modern consumers to pre-industrial elites, at least this may be a reasonable working hypothesis, then we would predict that during the good times the elites would easily become accustomed to elevated levels of consumption, and this expansion would occasion little social comment. By contrast, should their level of consumption decrease in relation to the pre-INTRO due CTION, THEO re TICA LBACKGROUN D11, biased generations, the elites would be expected to react vehemently to this development. This argument suggests there is no contradiction between the bitter critique of the elites for their luxurious and wasteful way of life by contemporary social commentators and the equally bitter complaining of the elites themselves about their poverty and indebtedness. The deteriorating economic conditions of the elites during the late stagflation phase of the secular cycle do not affect all aristocrats equally. While the majority are losing ground, a few lineages, by contrast, are able to increase their wealth. The growing economic inequality results from the operation of what some sociologists call the Matthew effect. Merton, 1968. Poor aristocratic lineages tend to get poorer because they attempt to maintain their elite status on an inadequate economic basis. This forces them into growing indebtedness, which eventually has to be addressed by selling some of their assets, such as land. A wealthier lineage, by contrast, can maintain the level of consumption necessary for preserving its elite status and have some resources left over to acquire land from its impoverished neighbours. As a result, the poor get poorer while the rich get richer. The same dynamic operates on peasants during the stagflation phase. During periods of economic hardship, poor peasants must sell land or starve. As a result, at the same time that the majority are sliding into absolute misery, a small percentage of thrifty, hard-working, or simply lucky peasants are able to concentrate increasing amounts of land in their hands. At some point, such successful peasants usually attempt to translate their wealth into higher social status. This demand for upward social mobility is an important factor contributing to the elite overproduction that develops towards the end of a prolonged period of demographic expansion. During the stagflation phase, thus, economic inequality increases within each social stratum: peasants, minor and middle-rank nobility, and the magnates. Growing inequality creates pressure for social mobility, both upward and downward. Increased social mobility generates friction and destabilizes society. The growing gap between the poor and rich also creates a breeding ground for mass movements, espousing radical ideologies of social justice and economic redistribution. Dynamics of surplus extraction. The declining incomes of the majority of aristocrats have two important consequences: intensifying oppression of the peasants by the elites and increasing intra-elite competition for scarce resources. The elites will attempt to increase the proportion of resource extracted from the producers by whatever means that are available to them, both economic and extra-economic coercive. Their success will depend on the structural characteristics of the society. The relative military strength of the elites with respect to the producers and the state, legal and cultural limits on surplus extract, see HAPT ER1 12, Tyon, and so forth. If successful, elites may not only deprive the commoners of the surplus, but may also cut into the subsistence resource, resulting in a negative growth rate for the commoner population. Thus, the lord's surplus extraction, rent, tended to confiscate not merely the peasant's income above subsistence, and potentially even beyond, but at the same time to threaten the funds necessary to refurbish the peasant's holding and to prevent the long-term decline of its productivity. Brenner, 1985, A31. It appears that this stage in the secular cycle may be what is known among dynamicists as a bifurcation point, a point at which the system may follow one of several alternative trajectories. A classic example of such divergent trajectories is the disappearance of serfdom in post-medieval England and France, and, during the same period, the rise of new serfdom in Prussia and Poland. Which of the alternative trajectories the system follows may depend on its structural characteristics or may be a result of a chance event. We are essentially rephrasing, in dynamical systems terms, the point made by Brenner in his critique of the Malthusian theory. This thesis is illustrated by the recent study of Stuart Borch, 2005, which compared the effects of the Black Death in England and Egypt. In post-Black Death, England wages rose, rents and grain prices dropped, unemployment decreased, and per capita incomes grew. Although the economic recovery of England occurred later than would be predicted by the Malthusian model, by the year 1500 it was in full swing. The consequences of depopulation in Egypt were profoundly different. Wages dropped, land rents and grain prices rose, and unemployment levels increased. No economic recovery was anywhere in sight by 1500. In fact, agricultural output declined between 1350 and 1500 by 68%. Borch argues convincingly that the persistent stagnation of post-Black Death Egypt is explained by structural factors. After 1250, Egypt was ruled by a particularly cohesive and militarily capable group of elites, specialized slave warriors known as Mamluks, as evidenced, for example, by their success at repelling the Mongol invasions in the second half of the 13th century. English peasants could resist elites by hiding in the hills and forests, of which there was an abundance in a depopulated England. Additionally, the longbow negated the advantage in military power usually enjoyed by the elites. By contrast, Egypt's narrow strip of arable land between uninhabitable desert left no room for evasive tactics. After the Black Death, Mamluks were able to use their tremendous coercive power to maintain the pre-plague level of resource extraction from a greatly diminished rural population. Extremely high levels of exploitation of individual peasants precluded any demographic revival. The system, thus, was caught in a vicious equilibrium that was apparently stable with respect to internal perturbations. It was finally destroyed by external conquest, the Ottomans in 1517. INTRO DU CTIO NTHEO RE TI CALB ACKGRO UN D13. The second consequence of plunging elite incomes is increased intra-elite competition. The forms that this competition takes will depend, again, on the structural characteristics of the society. Probably the most important factor is the capability of the state to suppress overt violence. Here we consider the forms of intra-elite competition in the presence of the state when internal order is maintained. The situation after the state collapses or is seriously weakened is considered later. One recourse for elites facing declining incomes from agriculture was to seek employment with the state or church bureaucracy. Because training improved one's chances, a curious side effect of increased competition for such positions was the credentialing crisis, Collins, 1979. A rapid expansion of enrollments at the educational institutions, at least in those societies that offered formal training to aspirants for elite positions. Thus, we can use trends in higher education as an index of intra-elite competition, Goldstone 1991:123. Another useful index of intra-elite conflict is the level of civil litigation, Goldstone 1991:120. Impoverished elites could also improve their incomes by attaching themselves to the retinues of powerful magnates. In 15th century England, this trend resulted in what is known as bastard feudalism. Dyer, 1989:35. A large retinue was necessary to advance the lord's interests in government, litigation, and even civil war. However, limits on available land, civil and ecclesiastical offices, and royal patronage lead to increasingly polarized factional battles between patron-client groups for available spoils, Goldstone, 1991:119. As a result, the elites tend to lose their unity and split along numerous fission lines. New elites versus old, one religious faction against the other, regional elites against the center, and so on. Because there are not enough resources for everybody, certain segments of elites, or groups aspiring to elite status, inevitably end up as the losers. We refer to them as the counter-elites, or dissident elites. Usually the counter-elites do not constitute a true sociological group, because there is little that unifies them apart from hatred for the existing regime and a burning desire to bring it down. Incidentally, we are not implying here that the motivations of the counter-elites are purely economical. The late stagflation phase, as we argued above, is typically characterized by a harsh oppression of the productive segments of the society and extreme social inequality, offering ample ideological justification for revolutionary action. State breakdown. Social trends resulting from demographic growth, declining surplus production, popular immiseration, and intra-elite competition have a profound impact on the ability of the state to maintain internal order or even to survive, Goldstone 1991. Population growth leads to expansion of RCHAPTER 114. Mise and bureaucracies, resulting in rising state expenditures. An increased number of aspirants for elite positions puts further fiscal strain on the state. Thus, states have no choice but to seek to expand taxation despite resists. Tants from the elites and the general populace. Yet the amount of surplus production declines, as discussed in the previous section, and the state must compete for this shrinking surplus with increasingly desperate elites. As a result, attempts to increase revenues cannot offset the spiraling state expenses, and even though the state is rapidly raising taxes, it is still headed for fiscal crisis. Note that declining real revenues may be masked by persistent price inflation, and it is therefore important to express all fiscal flows in real terms. As we discussed in the previous section, population growth leads to rural misery, urban migration, falling real wages, and an increased frequency of food riots and wage protests. After a certain lag time, the negative effects of population expansion begin to affect the elites, who become riven by increasing rivalry and factionalism. Another consequence of rapid popular tie-in growth is the expansion of youth cohorts. This segment of the popular tie-in is particularly impacted by lack of employment opportunities. Finally, growing economic inequality, elite competition, and popular discontent fuel ideological conflicts. For example, in early modern Europe, dissident elites and dissatisfied artisans were widely recruited into heterodox religious movements. As all these trends intensify, the end result is state bankruptcy and consequent loss of the military control, elite movements of regional and national rebellion, and a combination of elite mobilized and popular uprisings following the breakdown of central authority. Goldstone, 1991, 25. Internal war among political factions is only one aspect of increased interpersonal violence. A breakdown of social order is also accompanied by increased banditry, homicides, and other kinds of violent crimes. On the ideological level, the feeling of social pessimism is pervasive, and the legitimacy of the state authority is at its lowest point. The society approaches a condition that may appropriately be called Hobbesian. Hobbes himself lived during such a period. We refer to these conditions collectively as high socio-political instability. The effect of socio-political instability on population dynamics. In the previous sections, we focused on the manifold effects of population growth on various structures of the society, including a bundle of variables that we call socio-political instability. Here we consider the feedback effect. How does instability affect population dynamics? We can envision two gene-eral and actually interrelated ways. By affecting demographic rates and by affecting the productive ability of the society, Turchin 2003b, 120 to 121, INTRO du CTION, THEO re TICALBACKGRO UND15. Most obviously, when the state is weak or absent, the populace will suffer from elevated mortality due to increased crime, banditry, and internal warfare, civil war. External war may also play a role. Although external warfare between states has been a constant feature of agrarian states, its effect on demography should change with the phase of the secular cycle. When the state is strong, warfare is directed outward, and the areas that suffer most are the state frontiers, as well as areas outside, which are targeted for conquest. Collapse of the state and the ensuing civil wars reduce the resistance of the society to external invasion. As a result, internal warfare and external invasions by groups ranging from small bands of raiders to rival great powers can become hard to separate. This is, for example, what happened during the 100 Years' War in France. Warfare has also an indirect effect on mortality, because movements of rebel or invading armies spread epidemics. The times of trouble also cause increased migration. Refugees flee from war-affected areas, or areas whose productive potential has been destroyed. Migration has several effects. First, it can lead to emigration, and we can simply add that to mortality. Second, people on the move cannot afford to have children. Thus, birth rates decline. Third, migration leads to epidemics. Increased vagrancy spreads the disease by connecting areas that would stay isolated during better times. For example, in Ireland during 1810 to 44, the period just before the Great Famine, harvests failed or partially failed in 15 years out of 35. These failures did not lead to starvation, but they were followed by outbreaks of famine fevers, typhus, dysentery, scurvy, cholera, which were spread throughout the Isle by beggars and vagrants seeking charity and employment. Grigg, 1980, 138. Additional factors facilitating the spread of disease are the movements of armies and the expansion of international trade. The latter factor should be qualified by noting that international trade expands in the pre-crisis period stagflation phase, and then gradually declines after the society has descended into anarchy. Thus, the rise of widespread epidemics, pandemics is most probable during the late stagflation phase. In fact, the arrival of a pandemic is one of the most frequent triggers of the demographic structural collapse. On a more local scale, vagabonds and beggars aggregate in towns and cities, increasing their population size. This may tip the local population density over the epidemiological threshold, a critical density above which a disease spreads and below which it dies out. Finally, political instability causes lower reproduction rates because personal consumption plummets as a result of lowered production capacity. In the absence of organized ways to store surplus, peasants are unable to weather short-term subsistence crises. What stores are accumulated by individual households are easy prey to the marauding armies and other CHAPT ER-116 ATAs. In addition, during times of uncertainty, people choose to marry later and to have fewer children. Incidentally, people's choices about their family sizes may be reflected not only in birth rates, but also in the rates of infanticide. Thus, family limitation practices may be disguised as increased infant mortality. The second and perhaps even more important effect of socio-political instability is on the productive capacity of the society, the carrying capacity. Vigorous states often invest in increasing the agricultural productivity by constructing irrigation canals and roads, implementing flood control measures, clearing land from forests, organizing the colonization of underpopulated regions, and so on. The end result of these measures is mainly an increase in cultivated area, although some measures also increase the productivity of land. The other general mechanism is that the state offers protection. In a stateless society, people can live only in natural strongholds, or in places that can be made defensible, such as walled cities. For example, at the height of the Roman Empire, the overwhelming majority of the Italian population was to be found in the lowlands, where the most productive land was concentrated. After the collapse of Rome, settlements were moved to hilltops. Wickham, 1981. An even more striking illustration comes from the Huanca Hill Fort chiefdoms in the Mantaro Valley of Peru. Earl, 1997. Prior to Inca pacification of the region, the Huanca lived in crowded hilltop fortresses. After the conquest, the population moved down to lower elevations, where the best agricultural land was located. As a result, the diet and lifespan of both elite and commoner were dramatically improved. Johnson and Earl, 2327. The third example comes from Histoire de Charles VII by the Norman bishop Thomas Bazin, who described northwestern France during the 1420s, after a particularly virulent outbreak of the 100 Years' War. A state of devastation such that from the Loire to the Seine, and from there to the Somme, the peasants having been killed or run off, almost all fields were left for a number of years not only uncultivated, but without people. All that could be cultivated at that time in that region was only around and inside towns or castles, close enough so that, from the top of the tower or watchtower, the eye of the lookout could perceive the attacking brigands. Then, with the sound of a bell or horn or some other instrument, he gave all those working in the fields or vineyards the signal to withdraw to the fortified place. Quoted in Dupaquier et al. 1988. In other words, lack of effective suppression of internal violence by the state imposes a landscape of fear, in which a large proportion of agriculturally suitable lands is abandoned because they are too far from a place of int ro du ct ion, theo re ticalb ackg ro und 17. Security. By contrast, the strong state protects the productive population from external and internal, banditry, civil war threats, and thus allows the whole cultivable area to be put into production. Elite dynamics during the Depression phase. Sociopolitical instability affects elite numbers in a fashion that is similar to its effect on commoners, although the relative importance of specific mechanisms can be quite different. Thus, the elites may be little affected by subsistence crises. They also tend to escape more lightly the effect of epidemics. This is partly due to their better nutrition and the likelihood of getting better care during disease. But even more important is their higher mobility. Urban elites could withdraw to their country estates at the first sign of incipient epidemic, as in Boccaccio's Decameron. Higher nobility with estates in multiple provinces could similarly avoid an epidemic strike in a particular region. On the other hand, by virtue of their more active participation in politics, the elites ran a much higher risk of violent death. The death toll in some conflicts was extraordinary. For example, Dupaquier et al. 1988a 342 quote an estimate by Philippe Contamine that around 40% of the French elite may have been slaughtered in the Battle of Poitiers, 1356, and the same proportion at Agincourt, 1415. During the wars of religion in the late 16th century, 20,000 Huguenots were killed in just one day, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Cayman 1971:39. Loss of life or elite status could also result from state purges. For example, the first Ming emperor purged 100,000 Chinese officials, Tinyor et al., 2262. Sulla's prescriptions eliminated a third of the Roman ruling class, senators, and another third was eliminated by prescriptions following Caesar's death. See Chapter 6. A much less spectacular, but perhaps ultimately more important process reducing the elite numbers is downward mobility. The plunge in elite incomes, which begins in the pre-crisis period and is greatly exacerbated by the general population decline, affects most strongly the status of the lowest noble stratum. A specific example is given by Christopher Dyer for late medieval England. An esquire or gentleman living on £10 to £20 a year, who was employing only 3 servants and lived in one house, and whose meals were devoid of much luxury in terms of wine and spices, had little room to manoeuvre when his income plunged by up to 50% in the mid-15th century. They must have cut back, or even cut out completely, their occasional wine bibbings and avoided travel whenever possible. But too many economies of this kind might force them to drop out of the aristocracy and accept yeoman status. Dyer, 1989-108. CHAPTER 118. In summary, a number of social mechanisms exist by which elite surpluses can be reduced. 1. Deaths resulting from civil war. 2. Deliberate purges of elites by new rulers. 3. Limitations imposed on heir production, celibacy, primogeniture. 4. Downward social mobility, voluntary or forced by the state. 5. Increased material resources resulting from conquest or improvements in agricultural productivity. And 6. The development of a new political order that directs a greater share of resources to the elites. Several such mechanisms are usually operating in combination. The specific mix depends on cultural peculiarities of societies and historical accidents. End of instability and the beginning of the new cycle. Because the 3 main factors driving the rise of socio-political instability are general overpopulation, elite overproduction, and state insolvency, all these trends must be reversed before the disintegrative phase can end. Such trend reversal can occur in a variety of ways, depending on the characteristics of the society, its geopolitical environment, and various other exogenous factors. As a result, the last stages of the secular cycle are particularly rife with bifurcation points, and the socio-political trajectory can behave in a very non-deterministic fashion. The problem of overpopulation is usually dealt with during the crisis phase. One of the most common proximate mechanisms of population collapse is disease. But not all population declines are accomplished by catastrophic epidemics. Prolonged periods of civil war can also cause drastic drops in population levels, although typically requiring more time. Finally, the external conquest of a disunited society often results in a demographic catastrophe. An alternative to population collapse is an increase in the carrying capacity. After all, overpopulation results not from the absolute numbers being too large, but from too high a population density in relation to the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity can increase as a result of technological progress. This is probably what happened in early modern England. During the crisis of the 17th century, the English population hardly declined, while the average yield of grain per acre probably doubled. The end result was a 2-fold decline in the population pressure on resources. The carrying capacity may also increase as a result of the conquest of new underpopulated territories. An example is the conquest of the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates by Muscovy in the 16th century, which opened up vast areas along the Volga for Russian colonization during the succeeding centuries. Theoretically, the carrying capacity can also increase as a result of a substantial amelioration of the climate, although at this point, INTROGUCTIONTHEORETICALBACKGROUND19. We cannot point to a well-documented, convincing example of this mechanism in action. The processes leading to the reduction in the elite numbers and appetites were discussed in the previous section. The manner in which elite overproduction is abated depends very much on the military strength of the aristocracy. A non-militarized ruling class can be expropriated en masse by warlords, such as rebel generals or even peasant bandits. A rapid and comprehensive elite turnover results in a relatively short period of socio-political instability that follows state collapse. This is apparently what happened on several occasions during the Chinese imperial period, where the ruling class was dominated by the literate administrative elites rather than by military specialists. A rapid elite turnover can also result when there is a ready external source of potential elites, as was the case in the Maghreb described by Ibn Khaldun. We discuss Ibn Khaldun cycles in the next section. A ruling class that enjoys a preponderance of military power over both internal and external rivals can be reduced only by internecine fighting between various elite factions. This can result in very prolonged periods of socio-political instability, or depression phases in our terminology. Thus, for a new secular cycle to get going, the pressures of the general population on resources and of the elites on commoners must be substantially reduced from their pre-crisis levels. There is also a third condition. Not all societies are capable of the broad-scale cooperation that is required to construct a functioning state, and some societies with a previous imperial history can also lose this ability with time. Turchin 2003b, 2006. Thus, it is entirely possible for the civil warfare to gradually die out, but a centralizing integrative trend, nevertheless, failing to take hold. In this case, the area in question may persist indefinitely, or until it is conquered from the outside, in a fragmented state as a collection of small-scale polities. The potential explanations of this failure to build a functioning state lie beyond the scope of our book. Here we simply indicate that it is yet another possible bifurcation point. Phases of the secular cycle. Oscillatory dynamics do not go through truly discrete phases with clearly marked breakpoints, but for convenience in talking about each secular cycle, we need to divide it in phases. Our classificatory scheme is given here with the understanding that transitions between phases are rarely abrupt, so that any particular year that we designate as an end to one phase and the beginning of another is to some degree arbitrary. For this reason, we usually round the date to the nearest decade. Most broadly, the cycle can be divided into two opposite trends. In the literature, these are sometimes called the positive A phase and the nigger chapter 120. Tiv B phase, but we prefer the more descriptive terms integrative and disintegrative trends. Politically, the integrative phase is characterized by a centralizing tendency, unified elites, and a strong state that maintains order and internal stability. Internal cohesion often results in the vigorous prosecution of external wars of conquest, which may result in the extension of the state territory, assuming there are weaker neighbors at whose expense the state can expand. The disintegrative phase, by contrast, is characterized by a decentralizing tendency, divided elites, a weak state, and internal instability and political disorder that periodically flare up in civil war. External wars of conquest are much more difficult to prosecute during the disintegrative phase. If they happen, they usually take place during the intervals between civil wars and at the expense of equally weak opponents. More frequently, it is the external enemies that profit from the internal weakness of the state and society, resulting in an increased frequency of raids, invasions, and loss of territory. The population tends to increase during the integrative phase and decline or stagnate during the disintegrative one. Climatic fluctuations, epidemics, or being overrun by an external enemy can cause short-term, if significant, population losses. However, vigorous population growth resumes as soon as such exogenous forces stop acting. During the disintegrative phase, by contrast, population losses due to epidemics, famines, or wars are not made up by sustained population growth. Even when the proximate Malthusian forces, epidemics, famines, and wars, are in abeyance, the population often fails to increase, despite being much below the carrying capacity. It is useful to further divide the broad integrative and disintegrative periodes into subphases. Population growth is particularly vigorous during the first expansion phase of the integrative trend. This is a time of relatively stable prices and modest real wage declines, if any. However, as the population density begins to approach the limits set by the carrying capacity, price increases or wage declines accelerate. This is the stagnation or compression, or even more descriptively stagflation, stagnation plus inflation phase. Although the majority of commoners experience increasing economic difficulties during the stagflation phase, the elites enjoy a golden age, and their numbers and appetites continue to expand. The stagflation phase, and the overall integrative trend, is succeeded by a general crisis. Whereas expansion grades smoothly into stagnation, the transition between stagflation and crisis is often, but not always, abrupt. Discrete events signaling the arrival of crisis can be pandemics, extreme episodes of famine, or state collapse followed by intense civil war, or any such events in various combinations. The crisis phase in our terminology is not a discrete, brief event, which is one meaning of the word crisis, but an extended period that can last for one or more human generations. The INTRODUCTION THEO RE TICALBACKG RO UND 21 decline of population numbers during a crisis results in a situation of plenty full per capita resources. However, this does not necessarily end the disintegrative trend, because there are usually too many elites and elite aspirants, and intralite conflict continues to generate internal instability. Thus, the crisis grades smoothly into a depression phase, characterized by endemic civil warfare. The population may grow during the intervals between intense civil wars, but such increases typically do not last and are followed by declines, although not as catastrophic as those typical of the crisis phase. The depression phase ends when the ranks of elites are pruned by internal conflict to the point where the disintegrative trend can reverse itself and a new secular cycle begins. Alternatively, if no functioning state can get going, then the depression phase grades smoothly into an intercycle of indeterminate length. We wish to emphasize again that the classificatory scheme we propose is an ideal type. It is helpful to be able to indicate the rough state of the dynamical system with a single word. However, there is considerable variation in the trajectories followed by actual societies. Thus, the boundary between various phases should be taken as fuzzy rather than hard. An early reader of the book manuscript even suggested that, instead of dividing the timelines of the societies that we study too neatly, we could allow phases to overlap. There is some merit to this suggestion, because different phases are dominated by different kinds of social processes, and these processes often overlap in time. For example, the onset of political crisis does not always coincide with the shift from population growth to population decline, and therefore the dating of the stagflation crisis transition may be problematic. In the end, we chose to stay with non-overlapping phases, because doing otherwise would be too confusing to our readers. But we do not impose these discrete phases on each case study in a Procrustean manner. 1.3 Variations and Extensions. Factors affecting characteristic lengths of secular cycles. Our exposition and illustration of the general theory of secular cycles in section 1.2 was Western European-centric. But the theory should, in principle, be applicable to any agrarian society. In this section, we discuss how certain structural and cultural characteristics of societies should affect the demographic structural dynamics, with a focus on one of the most important characteristics of oscillatory dynamics, the average period of a cycle. Secular cycles are not periodic in the strictly mathematical sense, in which each succeeding cycle repeats exactly the preceding one. Although the secular rises and falls are generated endogenously by interactions B, C, HA, PTER 122. Between various components, subsystems of the agrarian state, macrosocial dynamics of agrarian states cannot be strictly periodic. There are at least 3 reasons for that. First, nonlinear dynamic feedbacks can, in theory, generate not only strictly periodic, cyclic in the mathematical sense, dynamics, but also a periodic chaos, erratic-looking behavior that is nevertheless produced entirely by internal endogenous reasons. The more complex the system, the more components it has, and the more nonlinear the interactions between the components, such as the presence of threshold responses, the greater is the likelihood that its dynamics will be characterized by sensitive dependence, the hallmark of chaos. Social systems are complex, and feedback loops are nonlinear, so the possibility of chaos can not be discounted, Turchin 2003b. Second, the dynamics of agrarian states are affected not only by their internal workings, but also by exogenous forces, such as changes in their geopolitical and ecological environment. Exogenous factors, unlike endogenous ones, are those that are not part of feedback loops, Turchin 2003a. They affect societal dynamics but are not themselves influenced by societal dynamics. Finally, individuals possess free will and can act in unpredictable ways. In principle, even the act of a single person, if it takes place in the right place at the right time, may be able to influence the trajectory of a whole society. For lack of better theoretical approaches, we can model actions of individuals at the micro level as a stochastic process, a kind of Brownian motion that also results in erratic, unpredictable changes in the macrosocial trajectory. For all these reasons, we do not expect a strict periodicity in secular dynamics. Instead, dynamics should have an average period, a characteristic timescale, with a substantial degree of variation around this average. The mean period of a single, boom and bust, secular cycle is determined by the characteristic lengths of its phases, which in turn depend on various social, economic, and political parameters. Thus, the typical length of the expansion phase is primarily determined by 1. The per capita rate of population increase, and 2. The population density in relation to carrying capacity at the beginning of the cycle. For example, if population grows at the rate of 1% per year, it takes 70 years for it to double. This is not a bad estimate of a typical expansion phase. Expansion phases are also affected by geopolitical environment. States enjoy the greatest ability to mobilize the society for a war of external conquest during the middle parts of integrative secular trends. Abnormally long expansion phases result from successful territorial conquest, especially when it is accompanied by colonization of conquered territories, which serves to reduce population pressure in the metropole. INT RODUCT ION THEORE TCALBACKGROUND 23. The length of the crisis phase is much less predictable because while there is a definite biological limit on how fast a human population can grow, there is no comparable limit on how fast it can decline. Depending on the agent of change, population can decline very rapidly, as in a pandemic, or more slowly, due to incessant civil warfare. Furthermore, pathogens afflicting historical populations varied in their lethality. A relatively mild pathogen could drive population down slowly, perhaps as a result of recurrent epidemics, resulting in a long decline phase. A severe epidemic, on the other hand, would lead to a very short period of drastic population decline and also to a deeper degree of social disintegration and longer depression phase, as happened in post-Black Death Europe. The characteristic lengths of the stagflation and depression phases depend more on the state, and particularly on elite dynamics, than on what the general population does. In particular, the military strength of the elites has a large effect on the length of the depression phase, or even if there is such a phase at all. Models tailored to the characteristics of Western European societies, largely monogamous elites enjoying a preponderance of military power over their internal and external enemies, suggest that the typical periods of secular cycles in these societies should lie in the range of 2 to 3 centuries. Turchin 2003b 138. Ibn Khaldun cycles. A very different situation obtains in certain Islamic societies. The paradigmatic example is the socio-political dynamics in the medieval Maghreb, brilliantly described by Ibn Khaldun, 1958. From the point of view of the demographic structural theory, the Maghreban states differ from Western European states in 2 important respects. 1. These Islamic societies permitted polygyny, and 2. There was a ready source of militarily powerful counter-elites nearby. Polygyny is important because the number of wives is the most significant predictor of male reproductive success in humans. Betzig, 1986. Because aristocratic males could afford to support several wives and concubines, the rate of elite population growth in Islamic societies was, and is today, much greater than that for elites in Christian societies. It is true that some degree of elite polygyny was practiced in Western Europe, where aristocrats often increased their biological fitness by having multiple mistresses and then acknowledging their bastards. Nevertheless, the fact remains that the biological reproduction rate of Islamic elites was several times higher than that of Christian elites. The second factor is the location of Maghreban societies in the rather thin strip of arable land squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea and the desert. The desert, or rather dry steppe, and semi-desert zone between CHAPT-ER 124. The agrarian societies of the Mediterranean littoral and the extremely arid central regions of the Sahara was occupied by nomadic pastoralists, primarily the Berbers. These desert chiefdoms were not a significant military threat as long the agrarian states maintained their internal cohesiveness. But as soon as a Maghreban society experienced state collapse, it became extremely vulnerable to conquest from the desert. When demographic structural models are modified to account for these two factors, they exhibit very different dynamics. Turchin 2003b. High reproductive rate of the elites means that they increase much faster than the general population. Elite numbers, in fact, increase so rapidly that the commoner overpopulation plays a much lesser role, or even no role in bringing about the state collapse. As a result, the integrative trend of the secular cycle is over much faster than in the standard model, developed for the Western European situation. Once the collapse occurs, there is usually no lengthy depression phase, because it does not take much time to organize a coalition of desert tribes to pick up the pieces and establish a new dynasty. As a result of a shortened integrative trend and a missing depression phase, models predict a much faster secular cycle for Maghreban-type societies on the order of 1 century rather than the 2 to 3 centuries for Western European states. This prediction is in agreement with the observation of Ibn Khaldun that the dynastic cycle in the Maghreb extends, on average, over 4 generations. A generation time in humans is typically 20 to 30 years. Note that this is a true theoretical prediction. Models were not fitted in any way to the Maghreban data. The shorter cycle period follows directly from the structural assumptions of the models of a faster elite reproductive rate and rapid elite turnover after state collapse. Not all Islamic polities are predicted to exhibit Ibn Khaldun cycles. The key parameter, identified by the theory, is the rate of growth of elite numbers. Islamic societies that controlled the elite growth rates in one way or another are predicted to exhibit slower cycles, with periods similar to those observed in Western Europe. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, the sultans had access to an essentially unlimited supply of wives and concubines. However, when the old ruler died, only one son was allowed to replace him. All others were killed. Furthermore, top levels of bureaucracy and army leadership were recruited not from native elites, but by means of devshirme. In other words, the state, not biology, controlled the size of the high-ranking elite stratum. Only lower-rank landed elites were permitted to increase biologically, and, being not very wealthy, they could not afford too many wives. As a result, we can predict that secular cycles in the Ottoman polity should be much longer than those in the Maghreb. INTRO do CTION THEO RE TCA LBACKGRO UND 25. An even more extreme case is the Mamluk polity in medieval Egypt. Its ruling class was recruited entirely from the slave markets. Children of Mamluks could not be Mamluks, and thus automatically dropped out of the ruling class. In principle, this arrangement should have stopped dead the Ibn Khaldun's dynamic, and barring exogenous perturbations, should have led to a stable equilibrium. The fractal nature of historical dynamics. In general, different social processes operate at a variety of temporal scales. The shorter scales include daily, weekly, monthly, and annual cycles. Beyond that we have human generations, processes occurring on the time scale of centuries, including secular cycles, and longer-term phenomena such as social and biological evolution. As an example, we can consider the stock market, as measured by the Dow Jones Industrial Average, DJIA. The DJIA fluctuates on a variety of scales. Daily, because the stock exchange shuts down at night. Weekly, no activity on weekends. Annual, fiscal year accounting affects trader behavior. Multi-annual, business cycles. And multi-decadal, the Kondratiev cycle, although not all economists accept the reality of such long cycles. The DJIA trajectory looks fractal because the amount of fluctuation depends on the timescale at which the trajectory is viewed. If we are interested in understanding the effect of the business cycle on stock prices, we really do not care about short-term fluctuations. We certainly should ignore price movements within a single day, and probably even within a week. Thus, the time series with which we would want to investigate multi-annual oscillations would probably use DJIA values averaged for each week. Averaging is the simplest kind of smoothing, so what we have done is essentially smoothed away all uninteresting short-term fluctuations. Uninteresting, that is, from the point of view of the main question of analysis. On the other hand, if we want to know how holiday periods affect stock price movements, we would certainly want to retain within week fluctuations and perhaps go down to hourly movements to see how trading patterns behave during the short pre-holiday days. Now the variation due to the business cycle becomes a nuisance, and it might be a good idea to remove the effect of multi-annual and longer-term fluctuations by detrending. The point is that different questions require approaching an analysis at different timescales. Turning now to population dynamics, we observe that population changes also occur on a variety of scales: monthly female menstrual periodes, yearly subsistence and epidemic cycles, generational somewhere between 2 and 3 decades, and secular 1, 2 or 3 centuries, according to the theory of secular cycles. If we are interested in the dynam chapter 126, ICS of childhood diseases, then the appropriate timescale would be weeks or months to capture the within-year course of each epidemic. The incidence of measles, for example, begins to increase after children are brought together at the beginning of the school year, gradually building up to a peak in winter. If we want to understand how secular cycles unfold, on the other hand, we certainly do not need to know how mortality fluctuates on a weekly or monthly timescale, or that there may be a deficit of births 9 months after Lent as a result of devout Christians avoiding sexual intercourse. All such within-year or even year-to-year fluctuations are irrelevant for the purposes of our investigation. The appropriate time step is 1 human generation, and we need to average over smaller scale fluctuations. We also need to do something about very long trends driven by social evolution. This requires some kind of removal of millennial trends, Turchin 2005, 153, for example, as was done for the early modern English popular tie-in, see appendix to chapter 3. By smoothing within-decade fluctuations and removing millennial trends, we retain 2 temporal scales of interest. The longer one is the average period of the secular cycle. This is what needs to be explained. The shorter one is the human generation time. This is the time step of the dynamical process that is postulated to be the explanatory mechanism of secular cycles. It is important to remember that population numbers are a dynamic variable that has a lot of inertia on temporal scales shorter than a human generation. This is particularly true with respect to population increase. It can occur only slowly as babies are born and raised to enter the adult population. Even under ideal conditions, the human population needs at least 1 generation to double. On the other side of the demographic balance, mortality, it is theoretically possible for a population to collapse to a very low level or even to go extinct in a very short time. However, most typically annual variation in death rates, due for example to crop failures, can be quite substantial, but is largely smoothed out, buffered, at the level of total population numbers. This buffering ability of total population numbers is important in understanding how climate variability affects population dynamics. Annual variation, even if quite extreme, may have little effect on population change. If the population is well below carrying capacity, peasants may have sufficient stores to weather a year or 2 of bad crops without any demographic effect. In contrast, a long-term cooling, even if by less than 1 degree centigrade, may have a much more substantial effect on population dynamics by lowering carrying capacity. This argument is just an illustration of why temporal scales are important. In the real world, the effect of climate change depends on the phase of the cycle, the alternative crops that peas ants can switch to, and many other factors. INT, RO, DU, CT, ION, THEO, RE, TCALB, ACKGRO, UND 27. Generation cycles. The preceding discussion should make it clear that we are far from adopting a monocausal view of human history. The main hypothesis of this book is that demographic structural processes are very important in historical dynamics, but we would be the last to argue that they are the only thing that goes on. However, it is not a good research strategy to include everything one can think of in the model. The history of science shows, over and over again, that an attempt to incorporate too many explanatory factors into theories is self-defeating. As Albert Einstein once said, a theory should be as simple as possible, but no simpler than that. One particular process that is not part of the demographic structural theory, but has to be taken into account when studying secular cycles, is the fathers and sons dynamic, Turchin 2003b, 2006. This mechanism operates during the prolonged disintegrative secular trends that are characteristic of secular cycles in Europe. The empirical observation is that disintegrative trends are not periods of continuous civil war. In fact, there are periods when socio-political instability is particularly high, interspersed with periods of relative pacification. To illustrate this dynamic, during the disintegrative trend of late medieval France, the 100 Years of Hostility, good reigns alternated with bad ones. The reign of John II, 1350 to 64, was a period of social dissolution and state collapse, while that of his son Charles V, 1364 to 80, was a time of national consolidation and territorial reconquest. The next reign, that of Charles VI, 1380 to 1422, was another period of social disintegration and collapse. It was followed by a period of internal consolidation and national resurgence under Charles VII, 1422 to 61, which finally lifted France out of the late medieval depression. This is a general dynamical pattern of alternation between very turbulent and relatively peaceful spells that is observed again and again during the secular disintegrative phases. A possible explanation of such swings in the collective mood lies in the social psychology. Episodes of internal warfare often develop in ways similar to epidemics or forest fires. At the beginning of the conflict, each act of violence triggers chains of revenge and counter-revenge. With time, participants lose all restraint, atrocities become common, and conflict escalates in an explosive fashion. After the initial explosion, however, violence drags on and on, sometimes for decades. Sooner or later, most people begin to yearn for the return of stability and an end to fighting. The most psychopathic and violent leaders are killed off or lose their supporters. Violence, like an epidemic or a forest fire, burns out. Even though the fundamental causes that brought the conflict on in the first place may still be operating, the prevailing social mood swings in favor of cessation of conflict at all, CHAPTER 128, costs, and an uneasy truce gradually takes hold. Those people, like the generation of Charles the Wise, who directly experienced civil war, become immunized against it, and while they are in charge, they keep things stable. The peaceful period lasts for a human generation, between 20 and 30 years. Eventually, however, the conflict-scarred generation dies off or retires and a new cohort arises, people who did not experience the horrors of civil war and are not immunized against it. If the long-term social forces that brought about the first outbreak of internal hostilities are still operating, the society will slide into a second civil war. As a result, periods of intense conflict tend to recur with a period of roughly 2 generations, 40 to 60 years. These swings in the social mood may be termed generation cycles, because they involve alternating generations that are either prone to conflict or not. Another example of such social mood dynamics has been noted, for example, by Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., 1986. Furthermore, generation cycles keep cropping up in other contexts. The birth rates in 20th century America oscillated with a period of approximately 50 years. East Erlin, 1980, Makunovich, 2002. Many economic indicators oscillate with roughly the same period, a phenomenon known as the Kondratiev cycle, Kondratiev, 1984. The Kondratiev and Schlesinger cycles may be related to each other. At least, they often seem to oscillate in synchrony, Berry, 1991, Alexander, 2002. The Kondratiev wave may also be correlated with the war cycle, Goldstein, 1988. Our understanding of Easterlin, Schlesinger, and Kondratiev cycles is very deficient, and many researchers doubt the reality of these dynamics. This is not the place to try to make sense of this vast and confused topic, and in the rest of the book we focus only on the dynamics of socio-political instability. Even that focus is forced on us by the need to understand why disintegrative phases in certain types of societies tend to have multiple peaks of socio-political instability. Exogenous forces. The standard demographic structural model of section 1.2 focuses on endogenous forces representing internal feedbacks between such structural variables as population, social structure, and instability. real-life social systems are also affected by many exogenous factors that are not an explicit part of the model. We have alluded to some of them in this section. Here is a more systematic discussion of the important external forces. See also the discussion in Turchin and Hall 2003. Geopolitical environment. Strong and aggressive neighbors may take advantage of internal weakness of the state during the disintegrative phase of the cycle. Such predation may deepen the degree of societal collapse. In the worst case, the state may be conquered and annexed. INT-RO-DU-CTION THEORETICALBACKGROUN D29. To a nearby empire, a very powerful expansionist empire such as that of Chinggis Khan, may simply roll over the studied state and obviate its endogenous dynamics. Alternatively, the presence of weak neighbors may permit external conquests that could relieve population pressure in the metropole and provide an outlet for surplus elites, thus lengthening the integrative phase. Disease environment. Some pandemics, such as the Black Death, originate in distant parts of Eurasia and then spread over the whole continent. Such pandemics arose repeatedly within Eurasia, Turchin 2008. Their effect depends on the phase of population growth. For a population in the early stages of growth, the arrival of an epidemic could mean a minor interruption of the course of expansion. By contrast, a dense population is highly vulnerable to a pandemic, and a severe drop in population numbers could result in a longer and deeper cycle of disintegration. Social evolution. Of primary interest is the growth of agricultural technology that affects the carrying capacity of the environment. Significant increases in crop yields by elevating the carrying capacity will have the same effect on food prices and consumption levels as substantial population declines. Global climate. Its effects are similar to those of social evolution, inasmuch as long-term fluctuations in temperature and rainfall affect the productivity of crops and the carrying capacity. A society whose population is already pressing on its resources may be tipped into crisis by a significant worsening of the climate. In addition to the recurrent exogenous factors discussed above, we often need to take into account singular events or historical accidents that may have significant long-term consequences. A good example of such a singular event is the discovery and colonization of the Americas by Western Europeans, which resulted in torrents of precious metals flowing into Europe starting in the 16th century. American silver acted as an amplifier that created a stronger and more inflationary growth cycle in the 16th and early 17th centuries. In other words, the price revolution of the 16th century had two causes, monetary and demographic, Fisher 1996-74. 1.4 Empirical approaches. The main goal of this book is to determine how well the predictions of the demographic structural theory map onto empirically observed patterns in the studied historical societies. The synthetic theory, described in section 1.2, has four fundamental variables: population numbers, in relation chapter 130, to the carrying capacity, social structure, specifically the numbers and consumption levels of the elites, state strength, typically measured by its fiscal health, and socio-political instability. These variables are fundamental in the sense that it is the reciprocal interactions among them that generate secular cycles. In the parlance of dynamical systems theory, these are the endogenous variables. In each empirical case study, our aim is to collect data describing how each of these variables changed during the period of study. Ideally, we wish to have time series data, accurate measurements of a particular variable collected at regular time intervals. The ideal time step is 1 decade, but a human generation, 20 to 30 years, serves almost as well. This ideal is rarely approached in historical applications. First, there is usually a substantial degree of measurement noise. This is not a fatal problem, because we can use statistical methods to estimate how much useful information is contained in the data. Even the worst case, when we lack quantitative data and all that we can say is that a variable is increasing, decreasing, or staying roughly constant, can be quite useful as a test of model predictions. Second, we may have reasonable quantitative measures, but only for a few irregularly spaced points in time. Again, such data can be quite informative, especially if they are supplemented with qualitative indications about the dynamics of change between the anchor points. Reconstructions by knowledgeable historians can be surprisingly accurate, as Happ, penned in the case of estimates of population dynamics in early modern England that were later confirmed by the formal population reconstruction methods. Incidentally, there are statistical methods for time series analysis that can help us utilize data to their utmost, even when they are irregularly spaced, although we do not employ them in this book. It is frequently the case that although we lack direct measurements of some variable, with a little ingenuity we can come up with another one that could serve as a proxy for the variable of interest. For example, climatologists made great strides in reconstructing past climate variations by studying such proxy variables as tree rings, varves in lake deposits, and isotope compositions of air bubbles trapped in ice. A very useful source of information is archaeological records, e.g. Moore Aris 2005. Certain kinds of archaeological data, such as estimated numbers of dwellings during different time periods, can be quite good indicators of population dynamics. The population history of Novgorod is revealed by the density of leather shoe remains in cultural layers. Nefedov 2002. Such archaeological data often cannot tell us what the absolute level of population was, in people per square kilometre. But having quantitative data on the relative fluctuations of a variable is almost as good for testing theory. In fact, it is much better to have a time series on relative fluctuations than an excellent INTRO due CTION, THEO, Ray TCA, LBACKGRO, UND 31. Absolute estimate limited to one point in time. The demographic structural theory is about dynamics, that is, change with time, and it is impossible to measure change with a single time slice. Many quantitative data sources are available for testing theories about historical dynamics, and few of them have been systematically exploited. For example, the intensity of public building, especially of temples or churches, shows remarkable fluctuations in time. This index may reflect the amount of resources at the disposal of the state, the elites, or both, depending on the specific arrangements prevailing in the society. Another underutilized indicator is the temporal distribution of coin hoard finds. In 1969, Michael Crawford suggested that there is a close correlation between concentrations of coin hoards and periods of internal war and disturbance in the Roman Republic. See Crawford, 1993, 162. An other study documented a similar pattern in the late Carolingian period, Armstrong, 1998. Proxy variables have to be used carefully because they may not be perfectly correlated with the variable of main interest. Thus, we expect that the number of people per building or per room should vary with time. As a result, in order to estimate the total population within a certain area, the estimated number of rooms obtained with archaeological methods needs to be multiplied by the average number of people per room, which is usually unknown. Similarly, the number of coin hoards per decade is affected not only by instability, but also by the degree of monetization of the economy, and by how much time has passed since the period when the hoards were interred. The farther this is in the past, the more chances that the hoard would have been found before modern times. Although proxy variables need to be treated carefully, it would be madness to completely ignore them, because they are often the best quantitative information that we have about historical dynamics. One way to make sense of the proxies is to build an explicit model of the various factors that may affect them, estimate the model parameters, and then impute the values of the variable of interest. Statistical methods for doing this have been developed and applied to many natural science problems. After all, even in physics, we usually cannot measure directly a quantity of inter-est, such as temperature. We have to infer temperature by a proxy variable, such as the expansion of a small amount of mercury in a glass tube. In complex geophysical applications, such as locating underground oil, nothing can be measured directly, but has to be estimated by building a complex model of the underground geological layers. We will not be attempting such exercises in this book, but it is certainly something that can be tried in the future. There are many other endogenous variables in addition to the fundamental ones and their proxies. Endogenous variables are those variables CHAPTER 132 that are part of the various feedback loops postulated by the theory. Their dynamics are largely determined by other endogenous variables, but there also can be an element of noise, and they in turn influence how other endogenous variables change with time. Exogenous variables, by contrast, are those that affect the state of the dynamical system, but are not them. Selves affected by the state of the system. An example of an endogenous variable is the real wage. According to Malthusian-Ricardian theory, the real wage is primarily determined by the population numbers in relation to the productive capacity. It can also be influenced by other variables. For example, intense internal war may disrupt grain production and drive up food prices, with a deleterious effect on real wages. Real wages, in turn, influence other variables, such as demographic rates, which then affect the rate of population change. The point is that endogenous variables as a set describe the various feedback loops that drive the complex dynamics of the social system. A number of such variables and predictions of the demographic structural theory on how they should change with cycle phases are given in Table 1.1. In the chapters that follow, our goal is to document the dynamics of as many as possible of these variables. INT, RO, DO, CT, ION, TAEO, RA, TCA, LBAC, KG, Rho, UND 33. Table 1.1 Empirical Predictions of the Demographic Structural Theory. Integrative secular trends, disintegrative secular trends, expansion phase, stagflation phase, crisis phase, growth, compression, state breakdown, depression into cycle. Fundamental variables. Population dynamics. Population increases. Population is high. Population declines. Population is low. It from nadir. Rate of and continues to in from the peak. The either declines at a growth accelerates crease, but rate of decline, decelerating rate or growth decelerates, accelerates, stagnates. Periods of increase possible but do not lead to sus. Tained growth. Elite dynamics. Low to moderate golden age. In high numbers. FAC. Reduction in elite numbers. Decline increasing numbers. In channelization and con numbers as a result of elite commoner ratio. Increased competition flicked. High corruption. Civil war and down. Modest consumption for elite positions. High income inequal. Ward mobility. Coal. Levels conspicuous con. ITI. Impoverishment lapse of elite con. Sumption by some of service elites. Sumption levels segments. Appear. Ants of counterlights. State strength and increasing. Social high but declining collapse. Social periodic attempts to collective solidarity. Unity among the elites. Disintegration restore state. Followed that may extend to by repeated break. Commoners down sociopolitical instability decreases. Instability is low, but instability increases. Instability is high, but instability to a low point. Increasing to its peak begins declining. Other endogenous variables. Number of rural increases. Slow increase or decline. Settlement. Lack of increased settlements, stagnation, abandonment. Land. Cultivated increase. A starting slow increase or decline. Settlement. At a low equilibrium, stagnation, abandonment. Land. Free. Initially abundant but in short supply. Increasing abundant, decreasing land to peasant ratio. High but declining low low. Increasing high land prices low. Increasing high falling low. Grain prices low, increasing high, very variable. Decreasing variable real wages. High declining to the low. Increasing but with high but variable. Est point much variability contingent rents, low high, high exploiter. Declining but with low but variable, tie-in by the land. Fluctuations contingent owners, personal consump. High, infrequent crop. Declining, poverty, subsistence crises. Contingent, depends tie-in. Subsistence level failure incidents have misery, vagrancy on instability levels. No lasting effect. Grain reserves, high declining, non-existent variable urbanization. Low increasing, growth high, but declining of cities. CHA PT ER 134. Table 1.1 continued. Integrative secular trends, disintegrative secular trends. Expansion phase, stagflation phase, crisis phase, growth, compression, state breakdown, depression, intercycle, artisanship and low increasing. Landless high, declining handcrafts, peasants become artisans. Trade at a low level, local increasing in volume. Declining, variable, local. Long-distance trading networks and spatial scale interrupted by polity. Networks disrupted cal unrest, usury absent. Increasing peasant high, declining indebtedness, large private land. Absent low or increasing. High concentration of declining ownership, medium land in the hands of few large landowners. Economic inequality, low increasing high but declining incidence of rare. population increasing, post-epi. Often catastrophic. High but declining epidemics bounces right back. Demic population in. Population does not creases sluggish make-up losses. Internal peace and increasing, a golden high but gradually crisis, peasant upriss. Recurrent civil war, order age unravelling. Increasings, urban uprisings, political fragmenta. In resistance to intra-elite conflicts, chun, high susceptible. Taxation, jinal, nationalist iti, to external rebellions, invasions. Incidence of coin. Declining to low lev. Low, unless there is a rapidly increasing to peaks when state hoards, an indicator else, unless there is a catastrophic external peak owing to state breakdown and civil of socio-political catastrophic external invasion breakdown and civil war recurs instability. Invasion war state finances increasing revenues, declining real rev state bankruptcy loss. Finances generally in and stable expendi news, increasing ex of control over the poor state, but high chores, leading to budge expenditures due to army and bureaucracy variability and eatery surpluses. Growth of the army contingency and bureaucratic apparatus, taxes increasing stagnant, or even tax system in a state variable. Periods of declining in real terms, of crisis high taxes, alternate heavy tax burdens on, with collapse of the peasantry tax system. Ideology, positive, optimistic growth of social peace. Popular movements, pessimistic ideologies. Ideologies rule the simism, criticism of for social justice and the cult of death day powers that be. Ideo, abolishment of debts, logical and social, and for land redistry. Conflicts-bution state policy, internal policy is none. Increasing attempts at social reforms, some. Retrenchment, weak interventionist, lies, social reforms, con times leading to social eaning of the state, says Fair. Externally, struction of irrigation revolutions often results in increased interest in and other infrastructure. External invasion conquesture. Colonization of borderlands. External aggression for acquisa. Tie-in of new territories. Chapter 2. Medieval England, the Plantagenet Cycle, 1150 to 1485. 2.1 Overview of the cycle. We bracket the secular cycle of medieval England by two periods of intense and prolonged internal conflict. The anarchy during the reign of Stephen, 1138 to 553, and the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 885. Because this period, roughly 1150 to 1485, was spanned by the Plantagenet dynasty, including its Lancastrian and Yorkist branches, we will refer to it as the Plantagenet cycle. The end of the cycle, which we assign to 1485, is probably uncontroversial, since most authorities agree that the population regime in England changed from stagnation to growth at the end of the 15th century. As to the starting point of the cycle, sustained population growth in England apparently did not get going until the end of the 12th century. This is a more controversial point, and the empirical evidence supporting it is introduced later in this section. In our discussion of each case study, we use the following scheme. First, we present the data on the dynamics of the major variables that lie at the heart of the demographic structural explanation of secular cycles. We start with demographic and economic variables, then move on to social structure and elite dynamics, and finally to political aspects. Once the general outlines of the cycle have been established, we shift the focus to examining how these variables interacted with each other during each of the phases of the cycle: expansion, stagflation, crisis, and depression. Trends in population and economy. The major features of population movements during this period are not in doubt. Hatcher 1977, Hallam 1988b, Hatcher and Bailey 2001, Dyer 2002. There was a period of general population growth up to the late 13th century, a peak around 1300, a slow decline during the early 14th century, which accelerated to a population collapse associated with the Black Death of 1348 and its aftershocks, and a depression phase, Chapter 236. Figure 2.1 Population numbers and the Misery Index in England, 1150 to 1500. Population data from Hatcher, 1977, and Hatcher and Bailey, 2001, modified to show slower growth during the 12th century, following Hallam, 1988b, 537. The misery index is the inverse real wage, here measured as the number of days of work needed to purchase the standard basket of consumables, data from Farmer 1988, Table 7.11, and Farmer 1991, Table 5.11, during most of the 15th century, Figure 2.1. The first signs of population recovery made themselves known around 1480, and there was a sustained increase during the 16th century, which belongs to the next cycle. However, although the outlines of the demographic cycle are clear, we know much less about the quantitative details, such as the precise magnitude of the peak in 1300, and, more important, when the period of sustained growth began. The starting point of reconstructing the dynamics of English population is the Domesday Book census of 1086. The census lists about 275,000 persons. Hatcher 1977:68, who were either males of working age or heads of households. Harvey 1988. This number needs to be converted into total population. Additionally, allowance must be made for the omission of 4 northern countries and 2 major cities from the survey, and for the likelihood of unrecorded subtenants and landless men. Hatcher 1977:68. One important source of uncertainty is the multiplier that should be used to convert the number of heads of households into a total population figure. Russell, 1948, using a multiplier of 3.5 per household, estimated the population of England in 1086 as 1.1 million. By contrast, Poston, 1966, argued MEDIEVALENGLAND 37. Table 2.1 Population of England and Wales. Implied per capita population growth rate year, million, % per year. 1086 to 1149, 0.85 to 1230, 0.46 to 1496, 0.4612626.20, 0.7012926.52, 0.1713, 176.30 minus 0.14. Source, estimated by Hallam, 1988, B. 537, for a figure of 2.5 million. Currently, a multiplier estimate of 4.5 to 5 appears more plausible. Harvey, 1988-48, and the most often quoted number for the population of England in 1086 lies in the range of 1.75 to 2.25 million. Hatcher, 1977.68. The second anchoring point is the 1377 poll tax, which indicates there were between 2.5 and 3 million people in England at that time. Hatcher, 1977:68. Between 1348 and 1377, the population probably dropped by 40 to 50%. Additionally, there was some decrease from 1300 to 1348. On the basis of these considerations, Hatcher estimated the peak population in 1300 as 4.5 to 6 million, with the balance of possibilities pointing to the higher reaches of this range. Hatcher, 1977, Arubatiyette. A similar number was estimated by Hallam, 1988b, working forward from 1086. Using the information about the number of holdings recorded on various manors between 1086 and 1350, and assuming that the household size was 4.7 people and the 1086 population was 2 million, Hallam, 1988b, 537, generated the estimates shown in Table 2.1. These figures indicate that population and settlement expanded in an uneven manner during the period of 1086 to 1300. Earlier, in 1956, Michael Poston had suggested that population expansion was most rapid to 1130, while between 1130 and the closing quarter of the century population stagnated. Poston, 1973:276. More recently, the same conclusion was reached by Langdon and Machael, 2006:63. In fact, even this conclusion may be too optimistic. Certain data, although admittedly fragmentary, suggest that the population may have declined during the middle of the 12th century as a result of the civil war between the adherents of Stephen and Matilda. Thus, Jester Stephanie speaks of villages standing lonely and almost empty, and of fields unharvested because the peasantry had perished or fled. Miller and Hatcher, 1978. Furthermore, the amount of taxes collected during the early years of Henry II's reign shrank by 25% compared to 1130. This decline, Chapter 238, was not due simply to the disruption of revenue collection resulting from the Civil War. Officials reported that many previously productive lands were now waste. Furthermore, the fiscal machinery of the English state had fully recovered by 1165, yet it was only at the very end of Henry II's 1154–89 reign that his revenues matched those enjoyed by Henry I. Thus, it is very likely that the general population declined during Stephen's reign. Rapid population expansion resumed at the end of the 12th century and continued during most of the 13th century. The sudden appearance of inflation during 1180 to 1220, Harvey 1973, is indirect evidence of the changed population regime. Both Hatcher and Hallam estimate peak population